Hello and welcome. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about the while and do while loops. We've talked about the for loop, which essentially allows you to repeat code. There's other constructs in C called while and do while that do the same thing with just different syntax. So the while loop. The while loop is a mechanism for repeating a set of statements, and it allows execution to continue for as long as a specified logical expression evaluates to true. So more of the same here. Just like if statements will execute certain code, while statements will execute certain code based on a Boolean evaluation a number of times. Everything you can do in the for loop, you can do in the while loop. It's just different syntax. So what the while loops looks like is something like this. At a very high level, if we're looking at pseudocode, while this condition is true, keep on doing this. So to relate it to a more real-world example, basically, while you are hungry, eat sandwiches, something like that. So you're going to repeat code. You're going to keep eating many sandwiches while you're hungry. The general syntax for the while loop is as follows. And this is showing you the syntax for one statement in the body. So you don't need to provide brackets or curly braces. I tend to use the terms curly braces and brackets in the same terminology. So here is what the syntax looks like when you have one statement versus multiple statements. Multiple statements, you have to have those brackets. A single statement, you don't. They're optional. You can have them or you don't have to have them. The expression goes inside the parentheses just like the for loop and the if statement. The expression here is different from the for loop in that it's a single exit condition. It's just the expression. You don't initialize the loop control variable. You don't modify the loop control variable in between the parentheses. It's just the expression, just the exit condition. The condition for continuation of the while loop is tested at the start. Right, so this is top of the loop. So what this means is it's a pre-test loop, and what that means is it could execute 0 times or it could execute multiple times in the body. And again, this is going to be relevant because the do while loop is doing something a little different. The if the expression starts out false, none of the loop statements in the body are going to be executed. So that's why it's at the top, the test. So if you answer the first question, no, I'm not hungry, then you're never going to eat any sandwiches. You're going to move straight on to coffee or the next line of code. You're not going to enter the body of the loop. If the loop condition starts out as true, the loop body must contain a mechanism for changing this if the loop is to end. Otherwise, you're going to have an infinite loop. So with the for loop, where you modify the loop control variable in a single statement, it's the same thing in the while loop, except you have to do it in the body. So the body is going to initialize, or the while loop is going to initialize the loop control variable somewhere, and then it's going to modify it inside the body of the code. So as I mentioned, the while loop can do everything a for loop does. It's just different syntax. And again, the for loop is shorter. You can do everything in one line, whereas the while loop, you have to do everything. You have to do those 3 things on separate lines. So in this example, we have int count equals 0. This is the loop control variable. This is outside the while loop statement. If you were using a for statement, this would go inside the for loop before the first semicolon. That's where initialized in loop control variable. Then you have the while keyword, and you have inside the parentheses the Boolean expression. This would be equivalent to the for loop, the second statement right before the second semicolon. So this is what you check for true or false. And if it's true or false, you enter the body of the loop. If count is less than or equal to 5, then you're going to print out the count. The next line of code after that is very important, the plus plus count, because that's modifying the loop control variable. You have to do this plus plus count or you're never going to exit the loop. Because the condition at the top is saying if the count is less than or equal to 5. If the count is always equal to 1, you have an infinite loop. So that plus plus count, very, very important. Plus plus count, remember, is an incrementation operator. It's just saying count equals count plus 1. This loop is going to run 5 times. It's going to run with count equal to 1, count equal to 2, count equal to 3, count equal to 4, and count equal to 5. Once count is equal to 6, it's going to jump out of the loop and it's not going to exit any more statements in the body. So it should be, again, you should be thinking in terms of the for loop. It's just the loop control variable, and the modification of the loop control variable is not in the declaration of the state of the actual loop. It's not all in one line like it is in the for loop. Here's another example where the logic is controlled to end the loop. So in that first example here that I showed, this is a counter controlled loop. It's going to always execute the same number of times, which is 5. In the next example, this is an example where the loop may execute 100 times or 0 times. The condition that we're evaluating here in our while keyword, num is not equal to -1, is all dependent on what the user enters, because num is what the user enters. So this loop may execute 0 times, it may execute 100 times. It all depends on the input from the keyboard. And this is called a sentinel control loop. It's not counter controlled. It's based on logic and variable that can change. So while num is not equal to -1, and then num gets stored the value that we enter in the keyboard. If the user never enters a -1 in the keyboard, then this loop is never going to exit. So same type of syntax here with our while, right? Our loop control variable here is num. We initialize the 0 at the top, and then we read in modify it to see if we're going to enter the loop based on what the user entered in the keyboard. Then inside the parentheses for the while keyword, we actually check it to see if it's a -1. And then in the body of the while loop with the brackets don't need to be there because there's a single statement, but I like to put them in there. Then we also read the next input and we store it in num. If the user enters a -1 for that next input, it will jump out of the loop. If they don't, it will continue to execute and ask them to enter information. A do while loop is a little different from the for loop and the while loop because it's considered a post-test loop. So in the while loop, the body is executed while the condition is true. In the do while loop, where the body is executed for the first time unconditionally, the do while loop, because the test is at the bottom, means that you're always going to execute the loop at least once. You're always going to execute the body one time, at least. It could be more, but always one. It's never 0. Because the condition to test the exit is at the bottom. This is called a post-test loop. It's also called an exit-controlled loop. So you would use the do while loop if you wanted the loop to enter at least one time. Typically, you don't need to use a do while loop because you can still do the same thing in a for loop if you wanted to. You would just put the code outside the loop. So the do while loop is not really necessary, but there are cases maybe you want to use it. After initial execution, the body is only executed while the condition is true. So after the first iteration of the loop, it's going to then act just like normal loops. It will jump out if the condition is false. So here is what it looks like. The do is at the top, and then the testing for the condition is at the bottom with the while keyword. So do is a new keyword, and then you're going to either have brackets or non-brackets depending on whether or not you have multiple statements in the body. If you only have a single statement in the body, you won't have a bracket. You'll just have the do at the top, and then you'll have the while at the bottom of the loop, and inside the while, the parentheses, you'll have the Boolean evaluation. That will be the condition that you check. But again, because that condition is at the bottom, you're always guaranteed to execute the statement at least one time. And so the example on the left is one statement, the example on the right is multiple statements, so you have the brackets, the curly braces. And again, in this second example, you're saying you may have something like prompt for password, read the user input, and while the input's not equal to password, but you're always going to prompt for that password at least one time. So another do while loop example. The first top example here is an example of how the loop may execute one time or many times, but never 0. It all depends on what the user enters. It's always going to execute at least once, but this is reading input from the keyboard. We see the scanf function, and as long as the user doesn't enter 20, they'll be executing this loop. A while loop can also be a counter-controlled loop. That means it's going to execute a certain amount of times. In this case, it's going to execute 4 times in this example. We have int number equals 4, and then we have do at the top, and then we have the brackets because we have multiple statements inside the body, and we're incrementing that loop control variable inside the body, number plus plus. And then the condition for checking is still at the bottom, so you're going to execute this 4 times. And you'll notice the while keyword doesn't have to be on the same line as the right curly brace. Typically it is though, but it doesn't have to be. And the while keyword at the bottom too ends in a semicolon. You should also notice that. So we've learned all about these loops, the for loop, the while loop, and do while. What loop should you use? Well, first thing you have to decide on what loop you want to use is first, do you want it to be pre-test or post-test? Do you want it to execute at least once? Or do you not want it to execute at least once? If you want it to execute at least one time, then you're going to use the do while. If that's not a condition, then you can use the for or the while or the do while. You can or the for or the while. Right? So for the most part, when you decide what loop to use, it's always going to be a pre-test loop. You should stay away from the do while loop. It's just a better option in most cases. It's much easier to read. It's much better to look before you actually loop, Just don't start looping. It's better to check that condition at the top. For readability's sakes, if the loop is at the test, it's much more intuitive. Okay, so have that loop check at the beginning. Use a for or a while. And in many cases, it's important that the loop be skipped entirely if the test is not initially met. Again, because that's the case, the test should be at the top. You shouldn't always be executing at least once. For the most part, you always may not want to execute. So you should use a for or a while. Now the question comes down to, well, which one should I use, a for or a while? It's really a matter of preference, personal preference. It doesn't matter because, like I said at the beginning of this lecture, everything you can do in a while, you can do in a for. So if you just like the for loop better, the for is a little quicker sometimes because all statements, all the loop control modification and the initialization and the exit condition can all be in one line. But it's really up to you. Typically what I do is I'll use the for loop for counter-controlled loops. But again, you can use the same. If you actually wanted to use a for loop and make it look like a while, you just don't have the first and the third expressions. You just have the single one. So the for semicolon test semicolon is the same as while test. So this is just showing you that the for and the while can do the same thing. Just change the syntax a little. If you want to actually use a while loop, but you want it to act like a for loop, then you would preface it with the initialization and include update statements in the body. So what you would do is something like this, and you usually always do this for a while loop. But this is the equivalent of a for loop. The initialization is outside the loop of the control variable, the loop control variable. The condition to test is inside the parentheses, and then you're updating that loop control variable in the body of the while loop. And that's the same as the for loop, initialization, test, update, and then the body. There's no difference. Again, as I mentioned, I use the for loop maybe for counter-controlled loops a little bit more, but I'll use both the for and the while interchangeably, depending on how I'm feeling that day. So a for loop, like I mentioned, might be a little more appropriate if you want to initialize and update a variable in one line. A while loop is better when the conditions are otherwise. Again, counter-controlled loops for, sentinel-controlled loops, maybe the while loop. And here's an example of a while loop with a sentinel-controlled loop and a for loop that's doing the same thing again. Or a for loop for a counter-controlled. While loop can run many times based on what the user enters. The for loop is counter-controlled. So this is the while and the do while. Hopefully this is clear. Become familiar with these loops because you often want to repeat code. In the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about nested loops and also a little different mechanisms to exit a loop using a break or continue. Thank you.